Good morning and welcome. I'm Chris Meserole, a fellow in the Foreign Policy program here at Brookings. Today it is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome you all, both those of you in this room and those of you joining online, for the inaugural conference of the Global Research Network on Terrorism and Technology. You'll hear more about the network in just a moment, but first I want to say thank you again for coming and how delighted we are at Brookings to be hosting this conference. Although the major tech platforms have gotten better at identifying and removing terrorist networks online, as the recent attack in Christchurch makes clear, the issue of technology and terrorism remains as relevant as ever. We urgently need to better understand online recruitment and coordination, and we at Brookings are deeply excited to be hosting a research conference dedicated to doing just that. Before I turn over the podium to my esteemed colleague from RUSI, I would be remiss if I did not make a few other comments. First, as you'll hear shortly, the Global Research Network is supported by an industry consortium led by Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Twitter. I should also note that separately, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft have all provided support for the governance studies, metropolitan studies, and foreign policy programs at Brookings. We are grateful for their support, which helps make our independent and nonpartisan research possible. In that vein, I also want to underscore and stress that the views and findings expressed here today are solely those of the speakers and panelists themselves. Second, although we have a packed day ahead of us, we also have scheduled a few breaks in the agenda. You can find restrooms to the left as you leave the door halfway through this hall right there. And we will also be providing lunch in Summers Hall, which is directly across the lobby from this room. Finally, again, I want to thank you all for coming. We have a wide array of experts and officials with us today from across the policy and technology communities, and we could not be more grateful for your time and presence here this morning. We could also not be more grateful for those of you joining remotely via our live stream online. Although one of the panels will not be broadcast, all the others will be, and we are delighted to have a virtual audience joining us. If you want to follow along on Twitter, we also welcome comments on the Terrorism and Tech hashtag on Twitter. Without further ado, I'm going to turn over now the stage to Andrew Gossaert, the Director of National Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute, to say a bit more about the Global Research Network.
Thank you, Chris. I don't know if that applause was for Chris or for me. I was going to say, if it was for me, I always get slightly nervous being applauded up to the podium, because if the applause afterwards is kind of less enthusiastic, then it suggests that it hasn't been such a good presentation. As Chris says, my name's Andrew Gossaert. I run the National Security Studies program at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies, which is one hell of a mouthful, so we like to shorten it to RUSI. RUSI, if you've not come across RUSI before, we're a bit like Brookings in the UK, although we're even older. We were established in 1831 by none other than the first Duke of Wellington. But I would hate you to think that, that we're kind of a 19th century institution, even though that's as far back as we go. You know, a lot of the work that we do in security in particular is about some of the most urgent present and future challenges in the security arena, of which, of course, terrorism and technology is a very notable example. So part of my responsibility at RUSI is that I'm leading this project to establish the Global Research Network on Terrorism and Technology, which is an initiative, as Chris has said, that is supported by the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism. In a few moments, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Erin Saltman from Facebook, who's going to talk more about the Global Internet Forum for CT, GIF-CT for short. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is just to introduce you a bit to the network, what it is, what we've been doing as a kind of scene setter for the sessions to come today. So you've seen from the program that this is our inaugural event. And that's worth stressing at the outset because many of you, when you received the invitation or saw the notice for the event, may have been wondering what the Global Research Network for Terrorism and Technology is. You probably won't have heard of it. That doesn't mean that you haven't been paying attention. We have, since we established this just over a year ago, we have been being deliberately quiet in that we didn't want to make a kind of a big splash about the existence of the network until we actually had something to say. So the thinking behind today was very much launching the network not as a kind of as a new initiative, but as something that is already producing some research. And we have now begun to begin publishing the outputs of a total of 13 research projects that have been or are being conducted under the auspices of the network. One paper is already out, and we're expecting a lot more over the next few weeks. So in terms of what, or rather who, is in the network, it's a global network. So we are very pleased to be working with research institutes from all over the world. There's a total of 8 institutes in the network, 7 of which are represented here today. So in addition to RUSI and Brookings, we also have the International Institute for Counterterrorism at the Interdisciplinary Center at Herzliya in Israel. We have the Institute for the Policy Analysis of Conflict from Jakarta in Indonesia, the Observer Research Foundation from New Delhi in India, the International Center for Counterterrorism, The Hague, in obviously The Hague in the Netherlands, and the University of Swansea. So one of the drives behind the network was to try to broaden out some of the research from being purely kind of Western-centric. There's a lot of very, very good work in the area of terrorism and technology, particularly internet technologies. I think it would be fair to characterize most of it as quite Western-centric, European or Anglophone. So it's very important to us that we were able to kind of extend beyond the European and Anglo sphere. Our aim has been to conduct original research, primary research supported by secondary research on all aspects of terrorism and technology, with a particular focus on the internet, but not exclusively so, and to get that research out to communities, including the technology sector, academia, and perhaps most importantly government, but also the public. One of the things that many researchers working in this field will be aware of, the difference between the level of kind of public understanding of some of these issues and academic understanding can be pretty significant. And we are, so RUSI is a charity, and part of our charitable purpose in the UK is educational. So one of the things that we think is very important about this is we try to increase the levels of knowledge around the challenges in this field. Now, because this is one of the great kind of challenges of our age, or at least the profound social changes that are following on from the digital revolution, which terrorism and technology, terrorism and the internet, is a particularly kind of acute manifestation of that challenge. One thing we're definitely not saying is that there isn't already a lot of very good research out there. There is some fantastic research being undertaken in universities and research institutes, think tanks in the US, in Canada, in the UK, in Europe. But this is such a huge topic that there are always going to be some significant gaps, and there's always going to be more space to translate what's happening in academia into something that is kind of actionable and digestible by policymakers and practitioners. So when we were putting this research network together, we thought that we needed to focus not just on the aspects which tend to receive the most attention in this field. So I think it would be fair to say, perhaps others might disagree, that a very significant proportion of existing research really focuses on the internet and radicalization. It focuses on Islamist groups, particularly Daesh, Islamic State, and it tends to focus on content. Now, that's still hugely important, and one of our research themes, which you'll hear more about today, is on the production of terrorist content. But we feel also, we felt that we also need to focus not just on what is produced and who produces it, but also on the consumption of that material. So our second theme is consumption of terrorist content. Who consumes it, where, and for what purpose? And the where is important. I've already emphasized the kind of the international nature of what we're trying to do here. But one of the things that we are particularly interested in are regional differences and confluences. So how is terrorist material consumed in Indonesia as opposed to, say, the Middle East, or as opposed to Western Europe? So our third and fourth themes are law, regulation, and ethics is the third, and our fourth is public-private partnerships. It's useful to think of these things together in that certainly the law and regulation in this field couldn't be more topical. I mean, today, as you will know, the G7 meeting is due to look at exactly the issues that we're talking about under this theme. To what extent should jurisdictions be mandating what should happen in relation to terrorism and technology through the law and through regulation? And coming on to our fourth theme, public-private partnerships, to what extent should we rely on cooperation and collaboration between the technology industry and public sectors? How do you balance, if you like, the hard and the soft in order to achieve those difficult trade-offs between privacy, freedom, and security, which are at the heart of this issue? And finally, in terms of our themes, we're also interested in capabilities. So when we were putting this together, I had some very useful conversations with some key figures in the technology industry who advised me that it probably doesn't make much sense to try to tell Silicon Valley how to do technology, and that's absolutely not what this network is about. But we do think that there is a valuable space for research into what capabilities are required, and not just, if you like, the technological dimension. So we'll be hearing more today about issues such as the balance between the human and the machine in dealing with terrorist content. So we'll hear a lot more about those 5 themes in the research presentations, which are going to go on throughout the day. As we go through that material, one thing I'd ask you to bear in mind, particularly the academics in the audience, is that we've been running this for, as I said, for a year, with a little bit of startup time beforehand. A year is a very long time in politics. It's probably an extremely long time in the technology industry. In academia, a year is, just the blinking of an eye. It's the time you take just to read yourself into a topic. Well, that's not the way we felt we could operate here. So in a short space of time, we've started and are beginning to complete 13 small projects. They are small projects, so they're designed to be done within a very kind of tight budget and within a tight time frame. So we're not for a minute suggesting today that we're going to be answering all the questions that exist around terrorist use of technology and internet technologies in particular, but we do think that we're answering some very important issues, and perhaps equally raising more questions for future research, which we hope that this network will continue and be able to develop more research projects, and that in a year's time or 2 years' time we'll be able to come back to hopefully Brookings and have even more to say about what the Global Research Network has been up to. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Erin Saltman from Facebook, who I'm sure is very familiar to many of you as the policy lead based in London, but covering Europe, Middle East, and Africa for these issues. Erin is herself a researcher who studied the extreme right as part of her PhD, and has worked in a number of research institutes and NGOs in the UK before taking this key role at Facebook. So, Erin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and just a really big thanks to Brookings and Rusi for putting this together. I know that we've all been to many academic conferences, we've all read lots of the literature, but I think the point here is that we need a new nexus of communication between experts and tech companies. And so I'll speak very briefly to what the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism is and where this sort of sits within it. I know everyone needs another acronym, so GIFCT is what I will be referring to when I talk about the Global Internet Forum. But really, I'll be wearing two hats today, and I know we have further time later in the day where I'll be talking with Chris and fielding as many questions as you want, anything Facebook or GIFCT related. But this began in 2017, and even predating that, a lot of our larger tech companies, Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, Google, in the case of crises and various harmful catastrophes that might have a reflection in the offline and online world, oftentimes our companies would talk together. And previously, those conversations were pretty ad hoc as our companies were becoming more robust and also having to face the facts that not everyone online is there for purely benevolent purposes. And what we realized as this got more and more severe is that those conversations cannot be ad hoc, first and foremost because we need to be able to point to it, we need transparency around it, but also because increasingly the Internet of Things is so multi-faced. So I am sure, please raise your hand if this is not the case, that none of you have just one app on your phone. And believe it or not, bad actors are just as human as the rest of you and have a myriad of apps and a myriad of online tools that they will use because everyone uses the Internet of Things to do things better, faster, easier, cheaper. And that includes in the unfortunate cases where people are strategizing real-world harm. And that is something that as tech companies we have to face. And interestingly, coming from, as Andrew alluded to, an academic and a practitioner background, just looking at processes of radicalization leading towards violence, increasingly my subject matter was the online Internet of Things. If you look at youth radicalization, online harms, when the online-offline nexus comes into play, it is undeniable that while we can't blame the internet entirely, as these violences and terrorism predates the internet, we can see that there is a catalyst role, there is a functioning role, a tooling role, and not only is it the big companies at play, but we increasingly see smaller, lesser-known platforms that are being used, whether to host content or to have more encrypted, secret, private conversations. And so it wasn't enough for our large companies to have ad hoc conversations. We also needed an infrastructure to open the door in whatever way that we could be helpful to smaller platforms. And this Internet of Things looks very different in different parts of the world. So when we strategized what to do around the Global Internet Forum, the GIFCT, we really want to answer three questions, and that has developed the three pillars of our work, and those are our three work streams. One is where can we share technology in a way that also respects privacy and human rights so that we can work together to prevent terrorist exploitation online. The second is where can we share knowledge, and oftentimes this is very basic, declassified threat assessments and briefings, but also it has to be very global because what terrorism manifests as is very different in different parts of the world. So when I'm corresponding with colleagues in Southeast Asia, it might be Buddhist extremist terrorism. And increasingly, we are seeing cases of white supremacy terrorism. And it might also be Islamist extremist terrorism. And what that looks and feels like are going to have different names, different faces, and regionally different tech apps that might be exploited sometimes large, sometimes small. So we're increasingly trying to build out those work streams, and when we think about where can we share tech, that's largely a by industry, for industry effort. So we've made great strides in things like a hash sharing consortium. A hash is like a digital fingerprint. It's a repository of known inherently violating pieces of terrorist content for images and videos. And we have about 14 companies that are sharing a database of those hashes, and we currently have over 200,000 unique hashes in that database. And we have a taxonomy around that. We're hoping to be more transparent around that so we can get better insights and feedback from third parties and NGOs. But it's a way that we can provide a resource, and it's up to the other tech platforms how to use that. What we don't want to do is create a protocol where we're policing each other as the Internet of Things, or where perhaps larger tech companies are telling smaller tech companies what they have to do. That's not what this is meant to be. But we are there to make resources available so that other platforms can tap into that and use that where possible. We also realized with giving that sort of privilege, we also need to have a baseline criteria for membership. Increasingly, as GIFCT becomes known within the world, we also get interest from lots of different types of tech platforms. So at the end of last year, we created a baseline criteria for membership, which includes some aspirational points, like you hope to use technology in innovative ways to tackle terrorism, but also things like you openly call in your terms of service that you respect human rights. And I will tell you now that some tech platforms that are joining the network or attempting to join the network under that membership of do you respect human rights in your terms of service somewhere, sometimes it just says no. And that's shocking from a Western biased perspective, but we need to recognize that we're trying to push a baseline that might not just be the sexy tech fixes, but also baselines of what terms of service look like, that it explicitly prohibits violent extremist or terrorist exploitation, that you have a baseline fundamental understanding of human rights, that you have the capability to receive user reports. So if somebody on your platform sees something, they know how to flag it to you, even if that's just a basic email. And a lot of people that we are talking with through the GIFCT might have companies that only have 10 people, and that's considered doing quite well as a startup. And I can guarantee you right now that their 11th hire is not going to be somebody that comes with a background of violent extremist radicalization and terrorism. It might be their first policy person who's going to come in doe-eyed and overwhelmed at how many things, and terrorism might be the last thing on their list. So how can we create baseline resources to help companies plug in and at least get to a baseline prevention, even if that's just your terms of service securing up some of those talking points? Around the knowledge sharing, we have partnered a lot with Tech Against Terrorism, which is a UN Counterterrorism Executive Directorate mandated NGO. Again, we want to work with NGOs and academics so that it's not just tech going alone in a silo that might have our own biases. And so with Tech Against Terrorism, we've carried out workshops, over 10 workshops around the world on 4 continents. And that's so that we can bring maybe a tech perspective, but we can bring people to the table, including academics, including practitioners, including human rights NGOs from a region to tell us what it looks like on the ground for them and what their concerns are. So that, again, we forcefully break our biases of what we think terrorist exploitation might look like. And then lastly, around our academic pillar, and I know we were in London a couple days ago talking about this, and I don't want my words to be misconstrued, but a lot of the academic research, which we all consume to try to get to a better space, often ends with, and more research is needed. And that is true. We want to fund more research, we want more research is needed, but we also need some very practical, action-oriented research that just goes beyond saying there's bad stuff online, more research is needed, but actually says there's bad stuff, here's why it's there, here's how it's consumed, here's how the Internet of Things have changed. Here's how the migration from large platforms to small platforms back onto large platforms is looking. Here's what the new app of the day is. Here is what it looks like in Southeast Asia, and here's what it looks like in France. And that's really important because we have to be very practical. And as a former academic, if you can be a former, I think it's very important because having the luxury of working in the philosophical gray area doesn't exist when you start working for a tech company, because someone from our operations team will come up to my colleague Dina and I and say, terrorism or not, does it stay up or come down? And I'm like, well, philosophically speaking, it's in a great, like, no, you need to be able to have an answer. And that black and white approach is very difficult. We usually all agree on things like Daesh and Al-Qaeda. And I think Chris's research has pointed out that even Al-Qaeda, apparently some people don't have it on the list. So outside of those bigger, obvious post-9/11 targeted terrorist organizations, there's a whole realm of disagreement. Governments often don't agree. The UN is working on trying to get sanctions and resources to bring together different country perspectives, but we're in a new realm where we don't have the luxury to sit in the gray when people are flagging content to us or when we see somebody point out exploitation on our services. So we are really appreciative of having this academic network that I hope that we can continue to support and expand to get action-oriented feedback and perspectives that do have slightly quicker turnaround times, because I would love to fund a 3-year project, but I guarantee your research question after year 1 will be irrelevant in the online Internet of Things, and that's just the nature of the beast. So that we can have a better dialogue and make sure that we are not just doing it alone in a silo as tech companies, that we're not just saying, Facebook thinks this and we're right because we're big and we hired some good people. I think that's true, but it also needs to say, well, we made this policy decision because of X, Y, and Z, and here's the feedback that we got from this practitioner who's an expert on human rights. And as much as I want to solve for security, it can't be at the cost of privacy and free speech. And I think this will come up in some of the topics today, is that in the online Internet of Things, we have the impossible task of trying to juggle privacy, security, and free speech, which are unequivocally at odds with one another. And if you solve for one, it will be at the cost of the other. And the shifts and costs and balances between those are very visceral right now. So we can talk through later in the day, and I look forward to, I'm sure there will be some very high-level questions. I'm happy to field them later. But to start with, it's just to say there's no silver bullet in countering terrorism. There never has been. We evolve and the threat evolves. We shift and the threat shifts. And we think we might have solved it in one area, and we realize it looks completely different in another region. So we have job security for all the wrong reasons. We are going to continue evolving this space because some of these tech advances and working with experts really have gone beyond a whack-a-mole approach. They really have created a systematic infrastructure that is building out. And so I look forward to the continued dialogue, but I really appreciate the opportunity. It's also good to make sure tech companies are at the table when we talk about tech and terrorism, so that we can also debunk some of the fallacies, talk through some of the problems, tell you how far the space has come, but also identify how far we need to go in order to still feel like we're being effective. So I will leave it there and pass it off to our amazing first panel, which deals specifically with regional perspectives. And I'm so glad we're starting the day with just breaking outside of our own filter bubbles and biases of how we're seeing and defining and stereotyping terrorism, to take a look at what this looks like in other parts of the world. So thank you so much for having me. I look forward to it.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.